Depth of field is the focal range of a photo. It's the area or depth in the photo that is acceptably in focus.
As you can see in the graphic, we have a highly stylized camera on the right hand side and we have a football player on the left hand side. The red line running down through the middle of the football player is our optimal focal plane. That's the area of most sharp focus. There's also an orange line on the right hand side, and at that orange line is where we start to get into what we call the circle of confusion. But from the red line to the orange line will be acceptably in focus. It just will progressively get less in focus as it goes towards the orange line. Same thing going backwards. If we're going from the red line back deeper into the image, then we can see that actually we'll start to run into the circle of confusion again, but it does go a little deeper going away from the red line than it is coming towards the red line from the front side. It's called the 1/3 and the 2/3. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. You can also see that in the camera itself, it's showing you how the back side of the depth of field is the blue line. As it goes through the lens, it actually converges ahead of the focal plane, which is actually where our sensor is or where our film is. And you can see that's why it would be a little bit blurry. The white line is converging directly on the focal plane, which would make it actually tack sharp. Then also the purple, which is the forward or closest plane of the circle of confusion, because it goes through the purple, goes through the lens, then it converges way past behind what would be the focal point.
A shallow image or shallow depth of field means that the area in front or behind your focal plane or the subject of your photo becomes out of focus very quickly. A deep image or deep depth of field means that the image is in focus from the foreground through the back of the image or off into the horizon. Depth of field can be controlled or determined by three factors: the focal length of the lens, the f-stop, meaning the aperture opening, and also the camera to subject distance. Let's talk about focal length of lens first. Controlling depth of field with focal length has to do with the selection of the lens that you're selecting. Let's take a look at this graphic. You can see at 200 millimeters at f8, we have a very shallow depth of field, which is represented by the light purple area around the young lady in the graphic. When we use a telephoto lens, it collapses the image. It actually makes our area depth of field shallower. And if you look at the graphic here, we have a red line running down through all three of the young ladies. That red line is your focal plane. That is your area of optimal focus. And as we move away from that, it actually becomes more out of focus. At 50 millimeters, again at f8, we see that we start to get a little bit deeper image, which is again is represented by the light blue area. At 24 millimeters at f8, you can see that we get a very, very deep image. The depth of field depicted in this graphic isn't meant to be an exact representation of what the depth of field would be at each of these focal lengths, but is more of a general idea of what the focal lengths might look like if you were to actually use the different focal lengths that we're showing here. Now let's talk about controlling our depth of field using our aperture control. You can control the depth of your image by adjusting the aperture setting on your camera, which results in an opening or closing of the aperture inside the lens. Let's take a look at this graphic. If we were to set our camera aperture at 2.8, our depth of field would be quite shallow, and that's actually represented by the light green area around the young lady. At f22, you can see that our depth of field is increased considerably to include the dog and the young man in the back. Now the dog and the young man would not be as sharp as she is because, again, as we move away from that focal plane, the red line, forward or backwards, we lose more focus. It's a characteristic of optics that the area in front of the focal plane will go out of focus quicker than the area behind the focal plane, as you can see in the graphic. Finally, let's talk about controlling our depth of field with our distance between camera and subject. The closer your camera is to the subject, the shallower the depth of field. The further away from the subject your camera is, the deeper the image will be. So if you're looking for a shallower depth of field, pick your camera up or your tripod and move it closer to your subject. If you're looking for a deeper image, again, pick up your camera or your tripod and move it away. There is a fourth factor to consider when talking about depth of field, and that's the sensor size in your camera. If your camera has a reduced or cropped size sensor, an APS-C, you may notice that you're getting a better depth in your images. If you're using a full-size sensor on one of the more expensive cameras, you may also realize that you're getting a better shallow depth of field. Before ending our video, let's take a look at one last graphic. We have the focal plane represented by the yellow figure. We also have the depth of field that's defined by the two yellow lines. Beyond those yellow lines, represented by the orange, is the circle of confusion. We also have the 1/3 and the 2/3 represented by the fact that the figures are spaced differently as they move away from the focal plane, going towards the camera in the foreground and going back off into the back of the image. Again, the foreground goes out of focus quicker. I hope this video makes the subject of depth of field easier to understand. Understanding depth of field and how to control it will help you communicate to your audience what's important in a scene, or for that matter, even a still picture. And thanks for watching.